join me in welcoming John.
Well, it is indeed note the height difference. It is indeed a pleasure to be back with you all. When you travel and lecture as often as I do, there's always a feeling of melancholy because you know that 99.9% of the time when you go and lecture somewhere, you will never darken the doors of that institution again, no matter how darn good you were, as a speaker. And you'll have made wonderful connections with people, and then you'll never see them again except perhaps on Facebook. And that has not been the case with Louisville because I keep being invited, and I'm grateful for that because it allows me to cultivate relationships and communities of conversations that are sustained over the years. And so I'm quite grateful to be with you. Now, I have been invited today to speak to the broad question of how Christians can best be prepared to be good neighbors to growing Hindu and Buddhist populations who now live in this country. And that task is a daunting one, and I'm glad that some of us will have more time to continue this conversation tomorrow. In my remarks today, I want to begin by naming a broad range of concerns and issues that we must ask ourselves when we turn to the question before us, the question of interreligious engagement with these particular communities. You will see that I will offer today more questions than I will answers, and I think that's inevitable. Why? Because I think our engagement with these communities in the United States is relatively recent. In fact, we're celebrating a momentous anniversary that helps to explain the very reason for our conversation today. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's not just Selma, but I think it's also related to Selma, of course. That is, it was during that process of fermentation when America was beginning to become a more racially inclusive country that, and also in the Cold War struggles, it was difficult for Americans to maintain an immigration policy that largely confined immigration to the United States to white folk from Europe. And when race-based quotas that were largely put in place at the beginning of the last century were overturned by the Immigration and Nationality Act, that is precisely the key factor that is responsible for the presence of robust Hindu and Buddhist communities in the United States. So it's such a fortuitous and indeed opportune moment for us to be having this conversation on the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Without that act, I would not be here, my family would not be here, and we would not be having this conversation. Now, Christian engagement with Buddhists has a longer history due to Japanese immigrant presence, but even with respect to Buddhism, Christian interfaith engagement remains still, I think, at an early stage. However, Christians and other Americans are engaged in a vast cultural experiment with forms of Buddhist meditation, in particular mindfulness, practice, and Zen. Americans may not know much about Buddhism in its intellectual and ethical dimensions, but there is considerable familiarity with certain forms of Buddhist practice rendered generic. As you will see from one of the handouts, some Buddhists have begun to call this phenomenon McMindfulness. And we'll talk a little bit about McMindfulness today. So basically, I'm wanting to begin by naming that we're still in an early stage of this conversation, and hence it's appropriate that we begin with questions rather than seek to arrive at premature answers that I don't think anyone has at present. So let's dive in to our work. I begin with these words. Hindu is a false faith with false gods. I think it's great that Hindu people can practice their religion, but since we're the Senate, we're setting an example of what we, Idaho, believe. Those words were spoken not in the distant and ancient past, but on March 3rd. Yes, just about 2.5 weeks ago. The speaker was Idaho State Senator Cheryl Knoxall. She was explaining why she chose not to be present on the Senate floor when Rajan Zed, guest chaplain from the Universal Hindu Fellowship, offered Hindu prayers in English and Sanskrit for the first time in the Idaho Senate. Some other state senators also walked out, including Steve Vick. Vick, too, had some interesting things to say. He maintained that Hindu prayers should not be allowed because the American nation was, quote, built on the Judeo-Christian, not only religion, but work ethic. And I don't want to see that undermined. He was also reported to have said that Hindus have a caste system and they worship cows. Wonderful, isn't it? Mind you, 2.5 weeks ago, I found out about Vick's comments in a news story on the website of the Indian newspaper The Hindu. I make this observation to let you know that the words of Knoxall and Vick were instantaneously available in India. Hence, the episode was not just a matter of Idaho news or American news, but immediately became an international news incident. That is going to be decisive for our thinking today. Please bear that in mind. Knoxall's statements, in particular, generated strong objections from a variety of Idaho's religious leaders. And a group called Better Idaho delivered notes of thanks from 700 Idahoans who expressed gratitude to Zed for coming to Idaho. A broad variety of interreligious leaders also voiced their objections, and some called for an apology. Knoxall added that she did not mean to call Hinduism a false religion, but then she went on to say, it is a Christian nation based on Christian principles. I would have been fine if we had also had a Christian prayer, close quote. Now, meanwhile, also on March 3rd, in Calcutta, a group of 500 Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians gathered to protest statements by Mohan Bhagwat, statements that were sharply critical of Mother Teresa. Bhagwat is the head of the RSS, a right-wing Hindu group with close ties to India's current ruling party, the BJP. Bhagwat and others from the Hindutva or Hinduness movement deploy a rhetoric that is exactly parallel to the rhetoric deployed by Vick and Knoxall, but with one notable difference. Hindutva voices argue that India ought to be regarded not as a secular nation, as specified by India's constitution, but rather as a Hindu nation. If you just switched a few words around and made the appropriate changes of accent, the rhetoric is identical. Bhagwat's statements about Mother Teresa were made against a backdrop of recent provocative actions, outbreaks of violence, and speeches that have left minorities in India feeling profoundly vulnerable. In his criticisms of Mother Teresa, he argued that her work was driven by ulterior motives. He said, and I quote, "Mother Teresa's service would have been good, but it used to have one objective, to convert the person who was being served into a Christian." The question is not about conversion, but if this, that is, conversion, is done in the name of service, then that service gets devalued, close quote. The interreligious protest to those remarks in Calcutta and the strong response from many quarters were swift, not least because Mother Teresa is a widely revered figure in Christian communities, but in every religious community in the Indian context. The tendentious and malicious attack on Mother Teresa aside, though, the underlying issue of conversion is a profoundly thorny question for many Hindus. Consider the op-ed that you have before you that was published just 2 days ago. I bring this to your attention not because I want you to take this at face value. You ought not to take this at face value. The author seems to be allied in many ways to elements of the Hindu rite. But what he says here is still illuminating and disclosive for us, and we ought to pay attention. Note the title, "No, Christians are not persecuted in India." So he's responding to a very prominent column by Julio Ribeiro, who is some call him India's top cop, very famous retired police officer who is Indian Christian, highly respected in India by all parties. And he recently wrote a piece in which he said that he is beginning to feel like he's on a hit list because of all the incidents of violence against minority communities happening in India. To that claim by Ribeiro, the author of this piece says, "No, you're not on a hit list, but I feel like I am." Take a look at the way this article proceeds. Beginning with the third or fourth paragraph. "There is a hit list, but thankfully not with Ribeiro's name on it. Unfortunately, I am on it, as are all non-Christian communities in India and throughout the world. This hit list is very systematically organized and is backed by vast monetary and state resources." And then he quotes from missionary literature. And these are direct quotes. You can track them down and find them, and largely coming from American missionary literature. "Did you know that the Sonar people of Maharashtra, India, are the primary crafters of gold and silver Hindu idols? These idols are the most powerful stronghold that Satan has upon the Hindu worshippers in India and around the world. When the Sonar people embraced the gospel of Jesus Christ, the subsequent change in their livelihood could have a huge ripple effect in the world of Hinduism. As one international Christian worker said, when we reach the Sonar people with the gospel, we will see the collapse of Hinduism. Pray that the gospel would flow through and permeate the Sonar culture, like molten silver fills a mold." You can see who produced this literature. Comes from across the street, literally, I think, though I don't quite know where the International Mission Board is particularly located, but it is a product of the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. And then the author has to explain, not to this audience, but to his Indian audience, who the Southern Baptists are, and explains that this is a vast group and that Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton and George Bush and so forth are Southern Baptists, and so makes the case that this is hardly a minority group in some obscure corner of the American continent, not a bunch of marginal fundamentalists. And then again, you see these italicized passages describing the scale of and the nature of the language employed by Western missionary groups. The language is constantly one of targeting groups so that they can be reached. There's a kind of military idiom, as the author points out, in this literature, and an apocalyptic aim of trying to convert as many people as possible before the return of the Lord. And I'm skipping a bit. I want to quote here again one of the italicized passages. "Religious expansionism has not witnessed the scale, scope, and state resources in a long time. Detailed investigations by Tehelka reveal that American evangelical agencies have established in India an enormous, well-coordinated, and strategized religious conversion plan. At the heart of this complex and sophisticated operation is a simple strategy: convert locals and then give them the know-how and money to plant their own churches and multiply." You see the language here is very clear. And the author says, well, we feel like we're being targeted. Now, there's a slippery rhetoric here, because being targeted by conversion is rather different than being targeted by acts of violence. This is why I'm not willing to sort of give this piece a kind of face value. Nonetheless, he is being responsive to a very aggressive missionary discourse that is tremendously well funded by Americans and by American Christian organizations. And he feels, I think, with right, vulnerable precisely when some of these groups speak of their goal as nothing less than the elimination of Hinduism. So Hindus may not be under attack, but certainly Hinduism appears to be. So as you can see, Hindus feel targeted, and by evangelical efforts. And such efforts and such discourse on the part of Christian evangelicals is a perpetual thorn in the side of Hindu-Christian dialogue. Hindus are understandably disturbed at the thought of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars from the United States being directed at nothing less than the wholesale elimination of Hindu traditions by means of conversion. Now, these two stories of events happening on the same day, one in the United States and the other in India, raise many of the complex issues that condition and complicate Hindu-Christian relationships today. Caste, cows, false gods, Christian nationalism, Hindu nationalism, conversion, communal tensions in India, and the marginalization and caricature of Hindus in the US. These stories are also bound together, as I indicated earlier, by global networks of communication that connect us to each other instantaneously. What is said here, therefore, has immediate consequences in India, and what happens in India has immediate ramifications in the US. Hence, Hindu-Christian dialogue and encounter now take place in a transnational context. What happens in Louisville doesn't stay in Louisville. The questions raised by these two events happening, as I said, interestingly on the same day, raise at least the following kinds of questions. Who will speak for our respective traditions? The 700 who thanked Rajan Zed for his visit to Idaho and his prayers, or those Republican state senators and their political base? Who will determine the tenor of interreligious encounter in India? Mohan Bhagwat and the Hindu right, or the 500 who gathered in Calcutta to protest his inflammatory statements? How are Hindu and Christian traditions being shaped by their encounters in India, the US, and throughout the globe? What are these traditions becoming through this very process of meeting and mutual transformation? How can Christians and also Hindus be mindful of the transnational context in which interreligious relationships play out? And let me slow down for this question. How can we dispel the cliches and stereotypes that shape Hindu and Christian ideas about each other without ignoring genuine underlying issues? For example, as we meet together here this weekend, a conference has just concluded in DC, an international Dalit rights conference. As many of you may know, the term Dalit, meaning bruised or crushed, is the term used by untouchables in India today to name themselves and their community. If you pulled out your, I'm not encouraging you to do this right now, but if you pulled out your device right now and went to Google and typed in the words Dalit and lynching, you will soon and immediately find the situation that Dalits are facing today. So to speak of Hinduism in ways that say that Hinduism is nothing but caste caricatures, but to avoid the reality of the way in which caste and untouchability also functions, that too would be profoundly disingenuous. But imagine, for example, that you are in India, you are about to hear a talk by a famous speaker, you're Christian, and the speaker comes to you and says that Christianity in America is thoroughly corrupt. How do you know? Because what Martin Luther King said in the 1960s is still true today. The church hour is the most segregated hour in the week. Christianity is thoroughly marked by its failure to address the realities of race in the US, and white Christians are complicit in profound ways with the fundamental racial asymmetries that mark the American life. Now, if you were a progressive Christian in India, and these were the first words out of the speaker's mouth, you might actually agree with the content of his statement, right? You might empirically say, yeah, he's right. But that might not be the way you wanted the speaker to begin a presentation of Christianity as it plays out. This is to suggest that we are in a very delicate conversation when we have conversations with each other as Hindus and Christians. Because this complex of issues about caste, about race, about untouchability, and so forth, touch very sensitive places in both our communities. What's happening is that there are issues of power and privilege at play in interreligious encounter. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we account for the vast asymmetries of power and privilege, depending on the setting in which interreligious encounter happens? Hindu-Christian dialogue has a vastly different tenor and character in India, a country in which Christians are just 2.4% of the population, than it does here in the US, in which Hindus do not amount to even 1% of the population. So, the transnational context in which we have this conversation makes our conversations incredibly delicate. Because here, Christians have tremendous power, and Hindus are profoundly vulnerable. There, it's precisely the reverse. And yet, anything we say bears on both contexts simultaneously. And it's just hard to know how to navigate this thorny predicament. And that is why I think we have some really hard questions to face when we think about how to have conversations with Hindus. Because power and privilege shape this conversation in such decisive ways. A conversation that I might have with an 8-year-old is vastly different kind of dialogue that I may have with a professional peer. And even conversations between colleagues is marked, as we all know, by power imbalances. You can have one kind of dialogue with a colleague with whom you differ sharply if you have tenure, and quite another sort of dialogue if you're an untenured junior professor and your colleague happens to be the president of your institution. Right? In other words, these asymmetries have to be borne in mind, because when we talk about dialogue, we seem to presume parity in conversation partners, right? That they are roughly in the same position. Well, that is not so in this case. And we have yet to figure out how to solve these issues in Christian-Hindu conversations. Now, what about Christians and Buddhists? I'll be shuttling back and forth in my remarks between both communities. What are the factors that shape this particular relationship? The difference, I think, between Christian encounters with Buddhist traditions and Christian encounters with Hinduism are marked and profound. Although it is a bit simplistic to put it this way, the simplification nonetheless captures something valuable. While both Hindu and Buddhist traditions have about them the mark of being exotic Eastern religions, in the US context at least, one key factor distinguishes them. By and large, most varieties of contemporary Hinduism are not missionary traditions. By contrast, Buddhism has always been a missionary tradition. This distinction makes a world of difference and plays itself out in many ways. Relationships between Hindus and Christians can be marked by considerable warmth, but also a measure of tension. As I have already noted, one reason for that tension is rooted in the fact that Christianity is a missionary tradition that in the Indian experience has been allied to colonizing and imperial power. And Hinduism, which at least in the last 2 centuries has been in its mainstream traditions on the underside of global power, has largely been a non-missionary tradition. Other than the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, popularly known as Hare Krishnas, and a few other Hindu groups, most Hindus do not seek to convert others to Hinduism. The very notion of becoming Hindu is a contested notion in most Hindu communities. By contrast, Christian engagement with the world's religions has been deeply conditioned by notions of mission, evangelism, and conversion. As a result, it's hardly surprising that Hindus are profoundly apprehensive that Christian outreach to Hindu communities will be oriented towards I could never say this word, proselytization and conversion. Oh, it is one of the few moments when my Indianness shows up. This is a very basic worry, I think, that Christians will have to confront. But it's not the same with Buddhism. Buddhists have always been interested in presenting some version of Buddhism to various cultural contexts. And so at least this major difference generates a certain kind of parity, a kind of openness to mutual transformation on the Buddhist front. So what do Christian engagements with Buddhism in America look like? What are the challenges here? On that front, I'd like to bring us forward in time from March 3rd to March 9th. Yes, just a week ago. A fan of Pat Robertson's 700 Club TV show named Tina emailed him saying, "I work in an environment where all my coworkers are Buddhists. They talk about Buddhism all day long and try to preach to me. It didn't matter much to me before, but since I recommitted myself to Jesus a year ago, it has started to bother me. I remember our pastor telling us to teach others about Jesus so that they too can receive the salvation. However, every time I approach my coworkers, they end up offending me in ways that are criticizing the Word of God. But if I argue, I end up offending them. What should I do? Should I continue to insist on helping them or get a different job? Also, is this a sign that this is not what I'm created to do, minister to others?" It's a poignant question. I mean, it has humor in some respects, but there is a genuine human question being asked here. And here's how Robertson replied. "Look, if you are healthy, there's a mild contagion around you. Chances are you won't get it. But if you put yourself in the middle of a hospital ward where everybody has the disease except you, sooner or later you will be infected by it. If you're in the middle of hundreds and hundreds of people who believe that way, you've got an uphill fight. And I think your best thing at that point is to withdraw with dignity. Get out of that environment, because they're going to get to you before you get to them." Well, Brother Pat, it's too late for me. It's way too late. I'm already infected. Not only am I a Christian who is infected both by varieties of Hindu and Buddhist traditions, I teach in a Christian seminary where I routinely begin almost every class with elementary mindfulness meditation. Vipassana. One might say that I'm not only infected, but that I am actively seeking to pass on this infection to others. I am contagious. I am a contaminant of the Buddhist tradition to others in the American context. And what's less than clear from Pat's statement is how all these Buddhists manage to resist catching the Christian infection, given that they are not just surrounded by hundreds of us, but literally millions. Nonetheless, this is Pat's sort of response to the presence of Buddhism in the American context. On the other end of the spectrum, there is the enthusiastic embrace of Buddhist traditions, leading in many ways, and in many cases, to the phenomena of multiple religious participation, and even double belonging. I'd like to say something about this dimension of the American scene by singing a little ditty by the singer and songwriter Mason Jennings. Any of you know him? Maybe some of the younger folks? He's fantastic. Anyway, he's got a wonderful tune. It's very catchy. That was meant to be a joke, reference to Pat Robertson's disease metaphor of religion. So here's how Mason Jennings' song goes. Oh, Jesus, I love you, and I love Buddha too, Rama, Krishna, Guru, Dev, Tao Te Ching, and Mohammed. Why do some people say that there is just one way to love you, God, and come to you? We are all a part of you. You are unnameable, you are unknowable. All we have is metaphor. That's what time and space are for. Is the universe your thought? You are and you are not. You are many, you are one. Ever ending, just begun. All right, all right, all right. I love you and Buddha too. All right. I wanted to juxtapose those two positions. The conservative suspicion articulated by Robertson and what might be characterized by some of you as a kind of uncritical perhaps, but nonetheless open-hearted, enthusiastic embrace of Jesus and the Buddha. By the way, as this song is playing, there is a refrain going on constantly throughout the song in which the author, in which Mason Jennings is singing, or the backup singer is singing, I love you, Jesus. I love you, Jesus. Nonetheless, the foreground is I love you and Buddha too, both. So there's another chorus going on that, the backup singer is saying, and Buddha too, and Buddha too. It's a great song. You should go home and listen to it on YouTube. But I like singing, so I thought I'd just sing it to you rather than playing it. Now, if we were to attempt to characterize the general American response to Buddhism on a spectrum from Tina and Pat Robertson on the one hand and Mason Jennings on the other, my guess is, though I don't think we have good numbers, that far more Americans are closer to Jennings than they are to Brother Pat. Other than wariness on the part of conservatives, most are, by and large, not only open to Buddhism, but even open to practicing elements of Buddhist meditation. The challenge for our thinking about Christian encounter with Buddhism is about whether we can think of a broader range of options than either uncritical suspicion and unthinking embrace. Is there some more complicated way of engaging Buddhist traditions? Now, the Christian engagement with Buddhist traditions is not marked to quite the same extent by the blunt fact of missionary and colonial aggression, although that depends upon the country in question. But to begin with, both Buddhism and Christianity are missionary traditions. Both believe that their traditions are therefore portable, and as portable traditions, both are open to transformation by way of engagement with local contexts and cultures. Buddhists are therefore willing and open to teach Buddhist wisdom and practice to non-Buddhists, and non-Buddhists in America have responded enthusiastically. The widespread mindfulness movement has infiltrated virtually every segment of American life: hospitals, schools, the corporate boardroom, prisons, and the military. A central challenge here is determining what's happening to Buddhism in this process of cultural encounter and transformation. Who is driving this encounter? Are Buddhists in any meaningful sense driving this American turn to mindfulness? And what role, if any, are Christians playing in this cultural revolution? And how do race and class factor in this encounter? With the exception of military and prison settings, the popularity of mindfulness seems in America to be strongly raced. White middle class to upper class populations seem to be the primary practitioners of mindfulness. Meanwhile, Buddhism in the U.S. is hardly just about mindfulness and is hardly a white phenomenon. Precisely because Buddhism has been a missionary tradition, there are many kinds of Buddhist communities present in the U.S. The vast majority of Buddhists in America are not white, middle to upper class Buddhists, but are instead composed of immigrant communities. What this means is that there are a multiplicity of Buddhisms, and there is simply no way to talk in a univocal key about Christian approaches to Buddhism. Inevitably, the question will arise, which Buddhism? Tibetan Buddhism? If so, which Tibetan Buddhism? Sri Lankan Buddhism or Southeast Asian Buddhism? These immigrant Buddhisms must be kept in mind, and not just the exploding mindfulness movement. Otherwise, we get a very distorted sense of Buddhism and who's practicing Buddhism in the U.S. In these sort of opening remarks that sketch the lay of the land of our Christian encounter with Hindus on the one hand and Buddhists, I have laid out a complex range of questions and challenges that are questions and challenges that we must confront. It should be clear to you that there's no way that we can even begin to dive deeply down into this complex nexus of issues. We can at best scratch the surface. Nonetheless, I think there are some things I can say by way of getting us launched in the direction of thinking about the kinds of questions I've mapped out thus far. In the rest of my time with you, I propose that we think together very broadly about the entire question of how Christians should tackle the challenge of interreligious dialogue with an eye on Hindu and Buddhist traditions in particular. Tomorrow, for those of you who are in the class, I will work in greater depth and detail on the content of Hindu and Buddhist traditions in particular. Today our goals will be somewhat more limited. First, I want us to think about the kinds of interreligious dialogue and engagements that Christians might have with Christians and Buddhists, Hindus and Buddhists. Second, I want us to think about some of the core goals that ought to structure our engagement with Christians and Buddhists. And finally, I want to just name a couple of core virtues that Christians should cultivate in order to be rich and thoughtful participants in interreligious engagements. So my goals are to talk about kinds of dialogue, the goals of dialogue, and then some quick notes on virtues that we ought to cultivate in ourselves if we're going to be good dialogue participants. In interfaith dialogue, a fourfold, I should hold up 4 fingers, not 5, a fourfold categorical scheme has proved to be very helpful in orienting participants on all sides. Some of you probably have heard of this fourfold categorizations. Scholars and practitioners remind us that interfaith dialogue happens in 4 modes. And it's really important for you to focus on these. The dialogue of life, the dialogue of action, the dialogue of silence, sometimes also called the dialogue of contemplation, and the dialogue of theologies. In my remarks for the rest of our time, I'm really primarily going to focus on the dialogue of life and the dialogue of action with a hint towards the dialogue of silence, particularly as it bears on the issue of mindfulness. The dialogue of theologies will be for tomorrow. I think we pay a tremendous cost if we ignore that our encounter with Hindus and Buddhists takes place in every one of these modes. If we don't think about the concrete dialogue of life and the dialogue of action and move too quickly to the dialogue of silence and the dialogue of theologies, we'll operate pretty high in rarefied air and ignore the concrete context out of which some of the larger theological questions often emerge. So hence my desire to begin as close to the ground as possible. Now, I want to suggest that each of these modes of dialogue ought to be oriented around a distinctive goal. The dialogue of life ought to be oriented towards the goal of mutuality. The dialogue of action ought to be oriented towards the goals of justice, peace, and care for the earth. The dialogue of silence ought to be oriented towards the goal of a deeper knowledge of self and ultimate reality in an experiential dimension. And of course, the dialogue of theologies ought to be oriented towards a deeper theological knowledge of ultimate reality. Got that? Yes, the dialogue of life should be oriented towards the goal of mutuality, the dialogue of action towards the goals of justice, peace, and care for the earth. The dialogue of silence should lead us to a deeper knowledge of self and ultimate reality in an experiential dimension. And of course, the dialogue of theologies should lead to deeper theological knowledge of ultimate reality. Why am I naming these goals so explicitly? Well, if at least some of us are no longer persuaded that the goal of our encounter with other traditions ought to be focused primarily on conversion or proselytization. I can't say the word again. I'll just say conversion. Then we must orient our engagements with our neighbors around other goals, right? We can't just engage without some sense of why and what's motivating and directing our engagements. And if one set of goals has to be deprioritized or perhaps even marginalized, and we ought to talk about that, then we ought to offer another set of goals that are rich, compelling, and robust, that ought to orient our thinking. And I think these are compelling goals. So let's begin to explore each of these modes of dialogue. Let's turn now to the dialogue of life and focus on Hindus and Buddhists. Now, the phrase dialogue of life refers to all the ordinary ways in which people from different traditions routinely bump up against each other in the course of our everyday life in schools, in workplaces, on the streets, in civic organizations, the hospitals, and the like. Right? That's the dialogue of life. Most of us do not encounter our Hindu and Buddhist religious neighbors around interreligious dialogue tables. Priests and pastors in particular are likely to encounter religious diversity in the course of hospital visits, chaplaincies, and interfaith marriages. Persons from other religions are no longer on the other side of the planet, but often on the other side of the bed. These are some of the most common forms that the dialogue of life takes. Let me offer a brief example from New York, but not from the Buddhist or Hindu traditions, but because it's topical. Just, I think, last week or maybe the week before, our mayor, de Blasio, made an announcement that the New York City school system will have 2 new holidays included in the school calendar, Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitr. The creation of these holidays gives us a sense for what the dialogue of life might look like, because we can well imagine children from various religious traditions asking mommy and daddy or mommy and mommy, what are these 2 new holidays? What do they mean, right? Here, in the course of daily routine interaction, is the dialogue of life happening. And it is now a part of civic literacy to at least be able to give your kid 2 sentences on what these 2 breaking of the fasts are really all about. That is what dialogue of life looks like. I began my remarks with examples of how the dialogue of life can go badly wrong in our engagement with Hindus, both here and in India. Hindus routinely feel marginalized or caricatured in American public life in a variety of ways. The incidents of March 3rd offer a perfect storm of misrepresentation. Hindus worship false gods, Hindus worship cows, Hindus have caste. These are among the most common distorted representations of Hinduism that Hindus routinely face in the course of daily life. Let me offer another incident that discloses how the dialogue of life goes badly wrong. Last year, I took my students from my Hindu-Christian dialogue class to the Ganesha Temple in Flushing, New York. During the tour, our guide spoke about their Sunday school classes and how instruction at the temple differs from instruction that their children often receive in the world religions unit in middle school or high school. Our guide said, Here at the temple, we teach our children that Hinduism is monotheistic. But we know that is not the answer their teachers expect of them on their quizzes and tests in school. So we tell our students to answer that Hinduism is polytheistic when taking their tests in school. Now, I have not been able to get those words out of my mind since last year. I just keep coming back to them. And I find myself asking, what does this mean that they have to say this? What does it mean that young Hindu students are taught to conform to curricular expectations by misrepresenting their own traditions? How do these children feel about having their tradition presented to them in school in ways that they cannot recognize as valid? These are some of the ways that school-age Hindu children have to navigate their religious identities in the course of the dialogue of life. Does that give you a feeling for what we mean by the phrase dialogue of life? These are concrete nuts and bolts issues about how to navigate religious identity in a predominantly Christian context. I have argued that the dialogue of life is vulnerable to profound dysfunction, both here and in India. And therefore, Hindus and Christians must work hard, both here and in India, to improve our relationships. The transnational connection between these contexts is also intimate and, as I said, can't be ignored. What we say here today in Louisville, if it's reported out, I don't know if the press is here, I see someone with a camera, might be picked up by a news agency in India. And immediate ramifications might have to happen. This too is a part of the dialogue of life. And so we must be mindful that everything we say and do in the dialogue of life is being heard and overheard by our religious neighbors. I have stated that the overall goal that should guide the dialogue of life between traditions is mutuality. What do I mean by mutuality? To aspire for the goal of mutuality might be summarized briefly as creating the conditions under which persons and communities can be seen and recognized as they wish to be seen and recognized. Mutuality, then, is for me shorthand for recognition and respect. Mutuality obtains when you see me as I wish to be seen, and I see you as you wish to be seen. Still more and deeply, mutuality obtains between two parties when each party knows and recognizes that his or her own welfare is inextricably tied to the welfare of the other. So it's not just a matter of recognition. It's a question of creating the conditions under which each party knows that their own welfare requires the cultivation of the welfare of the other. If you and your community suffers, then I suffer. Insofar as that orientation guides my engagement with persons from another religious community, then we have mutuality. In a situation of mutuality, therefore, Christians recognize that their well-being requires working for the well-being of Hindu communities in the U.S. and Buddhist communities in the U.S. Finally, I believe that a commitment to mutuality requires a commitment, insofar as possible, to rectifying asymmetries of power. To give rise to mutuality, we must work to create conditions in which communities that occupy very different positions of power can increasingly encounter each other as equals. In the U.S. context, that means that Christians must make a commitment to stand up for Hindus, to combat distortions and caricatures here that are often abroad in public discourse. Just the way those 500 people or 700 people wrote that letter of thank you to Rajan said, saying, no, those representatives don't speak for us. That is the kind of concrete, significant work that makes for mutuality at the level of the dialogue of life. What might that look like for pastors and Christian leaders? I can imagine any number of manageable, small-scale efforts that aim at inclusion and respect. The creation and inclusion of Hindus in a citywide interfaith council. Visitation programs, wherein a local Presbyterian church makes plans to visit a Hindu temple and sits in on a class on Hinduism taught by local leaders at the temple. The building of friendships between clergy and leaders in the local community, the local Hindu community, to identify issues of common interest. Such work in creating close ties that bind communities together in networks of mutual care before situations of conflict and tension arise is the key to success in the work of the dialogue of life. Finally, I want to suggest a difficult intra-Christian task that might contribute to deepening Hindu-Christian relationships. Can progressive and evangelical Christian groups dare to engage in a substantial conversation on questions of evangelism and conversion? Might Christians risk the work of difficult conversations with each other so that Hindus understand that the normative Christian goal is not the eradication of Hinduism by means of conversion? We were talking, as we were planning for this event, as to whether any Hindus would be present in the room. Are there any who identify as Hindus? I'm not surprised to see that the answer is no. I genuinely wonder, as I mentioned to some of the distinguished colleagues here, whether many Hindus know that there's a difference between how Southern Baptists think about Hinduism and how Presbyterians might think about Hinduism. I suspect that there are still profound, particularly in the South, a strong sense in Hindu communities that the goal for all Christians is nothing other than conversion. Nothing other than the elimination of Hinduism by means of conversion. I might be overstating it, but I don't think by much. So if they saw that Christians themselves are willing to have hard conversations with other Christians on questions of the relative priority of conversion and missionizing, that would be, I think, an important way of sending out signals to Hindu communities that not all that not all Christians are interested in characterizing Hindu traditions as idolatrous and demonic and in need of replacement and annihilation. If progressive Christians are unwilling to challenge such depictions of Hinduism, if progressive Christians are unwilling to engage in difficult and demanding conversations with evangelical and fundamentalist partners about how Christians might reimagine mission, it will be difficult for Hindus and Christians to enter into relationships marked by mutuality. All of this must be done delicately because on the Indian scene, there are any number of Indian Christians for whom conversion has been a matter of life itself. In particular, Dalit communities that have made the decision to move to the Christian context have found life in the Hindu, in frankly, escaping Hindu contexts and Hindu discourses about caste. So on the one hand, we've got to figure out how to signal that the only thing Christians are interested in is not conversion, and yet we cannot do anything that undercuts a fundamental principle of the Indian Constitution, which is that the freedom of religion includes the freedom to propagate religion. It includes the freedom to convert. How we do this is going to be difficult, searching work. But that is the kind of work that we must do in the dialogue of life. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what about the dialogue of life with Buddhists? The dialogue of life, at least on the American scene, is not nearly so vexatious when Buddhists and Christians meet. By and large, Buddhists are far less likely to be subject to misrepresentation and caricature than are Hindus. And when misrepresentation does occur, we might speak of a tendency towards positive caricature. For example, that all Buddhists are nonviolent and dedicated practitioners of meditation. Except for the kinds of offensive caricatures of the Pat Robertson sort, Buddhists, by and large, are not confronted with grave challenges in the dialogue of life with Christians. There is an exception. Buddhist immigrant communities, particularly those from Southeast Asia, often face challenges of invisibility and marginality. The factors, and I'm thinking in particular of countries that were deeply affected by U.S. intervention in the context of the Vietnam War. So Southeast Asian Buddhists from communities like Cambodia and Vietnam, who have been displaced in part by U.S. interventions in that context, are often profoundly marginalized and invisible in the U.S. context. The factors that lead to that invisibility and marginalization, though, are rarely religious matters, but are rather often racial and economic. In other words, often immigrant Buddhist communities are marginalized, not because they are Buddhist, but because they bear racial and ethnic identities that are not positively regarded in the American mainstream. Nonetheless, the dialogue of life with these Buddhist communities must take into account this reality of marginalization and must seek to render visible and accord respect where visibility, respect, and mutuality are absent. If the only forms of Buddhism that are afforded recognition and visibility on the American scene are white, middle, and upper class forms of Buddhism, then these other forms of Buddhism, these other Buddhist communities will be rendered invisible. That is a genuine problem that Christians ought to keep in mind and address. In the dialogue of life with Buddhists, the Christian community's task must be one of offering visibility, recognition, and respect for marginalized and economically vulnerable immigrant communities. The Christian pastoral calling is to see those who are unseen, to recognize those who are unrecognized, and to create structures of welcome and support and inclusion that weave these communities within the larger American tapestry. I think those are the primary challenges of the dialogue of life with Buddhists. Now I wish to make the transition to the dialogue of action and begin again with dialogue of action with Hindus. The phrase, the dialogue of action, refers to the ways in which religious communities can collaborate to address shared issues and concerns that bear on both communities. At an elementary but still meaningful level, the dialogue of action can look like a Christian church and a Hindu temple working together to build a Habitat for Humanity home, or cleaning up a local park, or planting and caring for a community garden together, or working together at a soup kitchen, perhaps bringing the youth group from the local Hindu temple and the youth group from a local church together to work and serve together. Such small-scale but still worthwhile work is indispensable and often a rich but manageable way in which communities can get to know each other and work to build networks of trust and care. And here too, there are degrees of difficulty. Thinking of diving suddenly, you ought to be prepared for the dive you take on, right? You shouldn't try, a 5-point dive right away. Something more elementary, a nice, clean dive, something simple, might be a way that communities can work to build trust by means of undertaking small, discrete, and manageable tasks before they venture to take on very difficult, complex, and contested matters. But the dialogue of action, I think, can eventually take on more rigorous and demanding forms after some substantial ties of trust are established. In particular, the dialogue of action can begin to move from the level of charity to the level of justice. We can imagine churches and Hindu temples working together to address local zoning laws that have deliberately sought to exclude the establishment of temples and mosques from being established within a local town or municipality. Any number of such common areas of concern might be identified. As an example, Hindus, both in India and the US, are increasingly becoming attentive to questions of ecological justice, as are Buddhist groups. Hindu groups are working to clean up sacred sites in India and are naming the contradiction between holding a particular site to be holy, say the Ganges, for example, and the terrible pollution of the Ganges. Hindus from a variety of theological traditions now are affirming, well, if we're serious about saying that the earth is suffused by divine presence, how can we let the levels of pollution that are present in our rivers stand? Now that ancient affirmation, that theological affirmation about the world itself as infused with Brahman, is being given new content as Hindus seek to clean up those sacred sites long held in reverence. I suspect that a similar sense of care for creation might prove to be a common basis for Hindus and Christians to work together in the dialogue of action. Now, once those kinds of things are ventured, I do think that then we can dare moving to still another level in the dialogue of action. And that is directly addressing some of the core issues that are sore spots in the relationships between Hindus and Christians. In other words, the dialogue of action can begin to look at conflict resolution, precisely on such issues as caste and conversion. My own intuition is that such issues can only be addressed after a good deal of work at the level of dialogue of life. When Hindu communities feel welcomed and are made to feel a part of civic and social life in this country, when sufficient levels of trust have been established, when other more manageable tasks have been tackled successfully, these difficult and thorny questions can also be addressed. In personal life and inter-community life, the measure of the depth of any relationship is the capacity for partners in that relationship to handle the truly thorny and difficult questions that challenge the relationship itself. Right? That's how we know whether a marriage or a partnership is a strong one. We know because then now we can talk about the difficult stuff. And having that as a goal for the dialogue of life, for our exchanges with Hindus and Buddhists, is a key long-term goal. Consider, for example, and this is really speculation. I don't know if this has even been done, but I think these are the kinds of things we ought to try. Consider, for example, building relationships of collaboration between progressive Hindus and progressive Christians, oriented not towards conversion, but genuine service to the marginalized, both here and in India. For Christian communities, care for and outreach to Dalits, the peoples, as I said, formerly called untouchables, is a major concern. For some evangelicals, such outreach will have conversion as a goal. But for far more Christians, the goal is service and not conversion. For Hindus, and in particular the Hindu right, such work is an object of suspicion. The argument is sometimes made that when people from such communities, Dalit communities, undergo conversions, they do so because of material inducements. So such Christians are sometimes called rice Christians. Some of this discourse is marked by extreme condescension and paternalism, suggesting that lower and outcast communities are incapable of reflection, agency, and decision. The very charge of material inducements is itself tinged with condescension. Right? All those Dalits could not have made this decision in a thoughtful manner. They had to have been induced. Nonetheless, evangelical Christian discourse is itself really and genuinely problematic. Right? So, I still remember my second or third week in Jackson, Mississippi. I just finished my doctoral work in Massachusetts. And yes, I moved from Massachusetts to Mississippi. That was quite a move. And I turned on the TV because I hadn't yet found a church. And I turned down to a pastor who sounded exactly like this. My friends, I have just returned from the city of Calcutta. And I can tell you, brothers and sisters, that never in my life have I felt the presence of the devil more keenly then in that city dedicated to that fierce demon goddess Kali. And I thought, pardon my French, holy crap, what did I do? Did I really just accept a job in Jackson, Mississippi? And I thought, what in the world would an American Hindu think if they happened to be turning on that station? So how do we deal with this nexus of, on the one hand, respecting and honoring the freedom of religion, including the freedom to convert, the recognition of Dalits to become Christians, and yet find ways to refuse evangelical and fundamentalist caricatures of Hinduism? These are the kinds of things that we have to do. And I think the dialogue of action can also begin to form the connections that can form the context in which we begin to engage each other with respect and trust. We don't know yet what a dialogue of action that leads to conflict resolution may look like just yet. But I can imagine, as I said, progressive anti-caste Hindus working with progressive anti-caste Christians to address issues together so that some new set of possibilities might emerge in which caricature is not possible. Now, a few quick words on the dialogue of action with Buddhists. I realize we're approaching the 1 hour mark, so I'll have to conclude my remarks, to speed up my remarks here a bit. The dialogue of action with Buddhists, I think, holds rich promise and even some historical memory of successful past collaborations. I am thinking of the work being done by engaged Buddhists like Thich Nhat Hanh. The phrase engaged Buddhism was invented by Thich Nhat Hanh to name his work in the heart of the Vietnam context, and his partnership with the likes of MLK in saying that the Vietnam War must be brought to a speedy resolution and that the U.S. must exit. Others like Thich Nhat Hanh, like Sulak Srivaruksha in Thailand, and still others in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, have sought very hard to give rise to a thick conception of Buddhist social action for the sake of justice, peace, and care for the earth. In the U.S. and elsewhere, engaged Buddhists are also working hard for gender justice, in a tradition in which it is often the male monk alone that has held positions of privilege. That is changing quite significantly in the U.S. context as women become teachers, authorized teachers, and the like. So engaged Buddhism has tremendous promise to be a site of conversation with Christians who are also committed to a variety of common issues and concerns. Engaged Buddhists have much to teach us about how to wed together contemplation and action. Increasingly, this is one of the primary discoveries of Christians who are, for example, liberationists. When liberationist Christians meet engaged Buddhists, something happens. Some of us have a common friend in Sharon Welch who tells in one of her books the incident of showing up at a protest for, I think it was a nuclear power plant, if I remember the narrative right. She speaks in her book of showing up angry. And she felt like she was going to, have a coronary. But then she saw the Buddhist monks holding up pretty much the same signs, opposing the same project, right? But they were present in a sense of calmness and light and joy. And she thought, what the heck is happening here? I want to be more like those people. That is to say that what socially engaged Buddhists seem to offer Christians is a sense that so often our own activism seems to be severed from any deep contemplative reservoir. And there's tremendous promise here for work with engaged Buddhists and learning from engaged Buddhists. Meanwhile, we press them also to think harder about issues of structure and imbalance, having a deeper analysis often than Buddhists do at the level of economics. So these are the ways in which I think the dialogue of action can take compelling form. Now let me conclude with some few words on the dialogue of silence or contemplation, focusing on this article, Beyond McMindfulness. We can't really talk about this article in great depth, except perhaps later when we're having conversation with each other, because it's wonderful. It's written by a friend of mine, David Loy, who is a Zen teacher, as well as Ron Purser. Loy has been doing some fantastic work in naming what he thinks is a real odd feature of American mindfulness practice. The severing of mindfulness practice from the larger network of Buddhist ideas and ethical commitments. So he notes how popular the mindfulness movement is becoming, and he notes that it's become a, quote, lucrative cottage industry. Business-savvy consultants pushing mindfulness training promise that it will improve work efficiency, reduce absenteeism, and enhance the soft skills that are crucial to career success. Note, in their branding efforts, proponents of mindfulness training usually preface their programs as being Buddhist-inspired. There's a certain cachet and hipness in telling neophytes that mindfulness is a legacy of Buddhism. But sometimes in the same breath, consultants often assure their corporate sponsors that their particular brand of mindfulness has relinquished all ties and affiliations to Buddhist origins. This strikes me and him as dialogue gone very badly wrong at the level of the dialogue of silence. Now this phrase, the dialogue of silence or contemplation, used to refer in the first instance to the profound encounters between monastics, Christian monastics, and Buddhist monastics. I think, for example, of the meetings between Thomas Merton and the Dalai Lama. In its initial context, the dialogue of silence was grounded in people who were profoundly grounded in their own traditions. And hence, it wasn't just a matter of trying each other's practices. Those practices were understood to be part of a larger network of ethical commitments and a religious worldview. And Merton was as much interested in those practices as what those practices signified by way of how they're connected to the larger tradition. What David Loy is naming is that now doesn't seem to be the case. There seems to be a genuine problem in which mindfulness is being removed and severed and cut from its roots in Buddhist practice. Uncoupling mindfulness from its ethical and religious Buddhist context is understandable as an expedient move to make such training a viable product on the open market. But the rush to secularize and commodify mindfulness in a marketable technique may be leading to an unfortunate denaturing of this ancient practice, which was intended for far more than relieving a headache, reducing blood pressure, or helping executives become better focused and more productive. This is an area in which I think Christians and Buddhists can really collaborate. A deep meeting can happen at the level of the dialogue of silence, and Christian communities can perhaps remind the larger culture that there is more to Buddhism than McMindfulness. And I think David Loy is beginning to say that this is something that has to be addressed if my tradition, he's speaking as a Buddhist, is going to not be severed. Finally, let me conclude with saying something about the virtues. I think Christians need fundamentally to cultivate at least two virtues in this entire process. There are probably others that we could add, but I would name hospitality and humility as the two H's that we ought to keep in mind as we think about this entire process. In our engagement with Hindu and Buddhist traditions, we are dealing with traditions that are thousands of years old. The origins of Hinduism are simply undateable because there is no founding teacher or instructor. And at the very least, some of the strands of the Hindu tradition go back to the Indus Valley civilization. that flourished as early as 2500 BCE. We are before a vast tradition about which we know a sliver. The notion that we can engage this tradition in any meaningful way without a profound sense of humility, that we stand before traditions whose resources we can never exhaust, is to set ourselves up for an engagement that is bound to go wrong. Humility, therefore, must be a foundational virtue for our engagement with Hindus and Buddhists. Likewise, hospitality. We know about hospitality as a practice in which we welcome others. But I want to end by saying that we also ought to cultivate what I call a hospitality of receiving. A hospitality of receiving. We all know in our lives people who excel at the hospitality of giving. They're wonderful at giving things to you. But when you try to give anything to them, they become profoundly awkward. They do not know how to receive. A variety of Hindus, most especially Mahatma Gandhi, have argued that a lack of this hospitality of receiving has been a marked feature of Christian encounters with Hinduism. You missionaries come to India and you have a lot to give us, but you don't seem interested in receiving anything from us. Please, if there is anything good in our country, please try to receive. I routinely commend these phrases from Gandhi because I think our relationships with these traditions must in the end fundamentally be about not just what we can do for them, but what they might do for us. How our traditions and our spiritual life and our quest for justice might be deeply and profoundly transformed by learning from them. Until we do that, religious diversity will remain a problem that we must navigate, and not a promise that we must receive. Thank you.